Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this very special event tonight, our first big event of the fall here for Princeton Public Library, and it's a library and Labyrinth live stream event. This is a part of a series where the library and Labyrinth Books gets together to do a series of author events, and we're really pleased to be having our first one be with a hometown author and in conversation with the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs. So I'm Janie Herman from the Public Library. I am going to be quickly turning this over and inviting Eric Crahan on screen, who is the editorial director of Humanities and Social Sciences at Princeton University Press. Welcome. Eric will be doing in just a moment the introductions of tonight's guests. And so this is also sponsored by the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. And I would also like to thank, of course, Princeton University Press, who is the publisher tonight and who helped us put this all together so wonderfully, that we're very grateful for that. And finally, I will be putting information into the chat. There are signed copies of this book, which goes on sale tomorrow. But Anne-Marie was able to go in over the weekend to Labyrinth Books and sign copies. I think there's only signed copies out there right now. So please do frequent Labyrinth Books to get this. I believe there's a 10% discount still in effect if you reference this event or if you order online and use the code word slaughter. And I will put all that information into the chat in just a moment. So Eric, why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much. Hello and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. Again, I'm Eric Crahan, the editorial director for the Humanities and Social Sciences at Princeton University Press. On behalf of myself and all my colleagues at the press, and in partnership with the Princeton Public Library, Labyrinth Books, and the Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs, I welcome you all and thank you for joining. I'm so pleased to have the chance to open this evening and introduce Anne-Marie Slaughter and her new book, Renewal, From Crisis to Transformation. Let's see if we can get it there, in our lives, work, and politics, which will be published tomorrow. Drawing on her personal experiences and enormous expertise, this book is fundamentally about how we as individuals, as organizations, can change. Deeply personal and drawing on her wide expertise. It's touching, thoughtful, erudite, reflects on the near and distant past, but also with an eye of the future and what that change could be. Anne-Marie Slaughter is the Bert G. Kerstetter 66th University Professor Emerita of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton, formerly Dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. From 2009 to 2011, she served as the Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State, the first woman to hold that position. She is currently, since 2013, CEO of New America and the author and editor of many books, including Unfinished Business, Women, Men, Work, and Family. Joining Anne-Marie in this conversation is Amaney Jamal, the Edwards S. Stanford Professor of Politics at Princeton University, and the new Dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. A scholar of comparative and democratic politics, she is the author and editor of 4 books, including most recently of Empires and Citizens, also published by Princeton University Press. It is my great personal and professional pleasure to introduce these 2 scholars and leaders and women who I greatly admire to discuss this exciting new book. So without further delay, I pass this off to Anne-Marie and Amaney.
Eric, thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. So maybe I will kick off, if that's okay, Anne-Marie. So it's really such an honor and such a privilege to be here to discuss Anne-Marie's new book. You know, I read it last week into the weekend, and I must say that, you know, it's just an amazing testament, an amazing collection of some of Anne-Marie's most intimate and thought-provoking, and if I may say, vulnerable moments in her career. So as a reader, I was not only touched, but I was honored to sort of be privy to Anne-Marie's intimate inside thoughts on her own leadership, the challenges before her, the decisions she had to make, the weight of those decisions, the responsibility that she carried, and what she was projecting to audiences across the country and indeed across the world. So it's no easy task. And for you to sort of sit down and put pen to paper, Anne-Marie, and bring this together in such a beautifully crafted book, I want to say I'm in awe, I'm inspired, and I want to congratulate you on a terrific book. I wrote
We
Anne-Marie
can
last
stop
night.
right there and we don't really need to do anything more. I'm very happy. I will just say goodnight to the audience and thank you.
But I have more to say, Anne-Marie, because last night I wrote you and I said, you know, when the clouds get gray and heavy, I will pick up this book because it will convince me to continue moving forward. And so for women and for leaders out there who basically don't have a manual with them on how to lead, this book is going to be very, very important and inspiring and extremely useful for the future generations. So in terms of thinking about your impact and legacy, Anne-Marie, I don't want anybody to undermine the importance of this book. So thank you for that as well. I also want to say one last thing before we start our conversation, and I want to give Anne-Marie an opportunity to tell us a little bit about how the idea of writing, although you sort of captured in the book, I'm sure that the process of saying, I'm going to pull the trigger and write it was maybe a little bit arduous on your part. So we want to hear about that. Before I do that, as the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs, I want to highlight the importance of the book for public policy. Oftentimes as students of politics, we sort of look at realities around us and we sort of feel stuck sometimes in institutionalized structures that are not changeable, or that we all live in these path-dependent processes that are very difficult to reverse. And what this book does, at least for students of public policy, and that's why it's important for anybody interested in public policy and making change, to pick up this book to understand that institutionalized ways, institutionalized pasts, institutionalized processes can be reversed, but they require agency and they require keen insight and the courage to step up and for people to say, it's time to sort of think about things differently. And this is what Anne-Marie's story encapsulates here. You know, in my opinion, I think Anne-Marie is bearing responsibility for legacies that pre-existed her. But I admire that she is trying to sort of, trying to carry it on her shoulders and accept the responsibility by, and hopefully motivating others to do the same. But, you know, Anne-Marie, the problems in this country did not start with you.
And they're not going to end with me.
Probably not going to end with you. But I really appreciated how much you could see in the book the weight of the crisis in our country that you're carrying on your shoulders. And for that, I also want to say I respect and admire, and I'm grateful for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I do want to come back to this point of clearly this, you know, you were dealing with some personal strife, and I'm not, you know, maybe Anne-Marie, I'll let you talk about it, personal strife at the New America Foundation. But then you wrote this book, it seems to me like over, you know, in 2020, 2021. And so what was the trigger point for you that said, you know what, I'm really going to tell my story. It's time to tell my story.
Well, Amaney, first of all, Amaney, thank you for agreeing to do this. And for those of you who don't know, you know, it's just such a pleasure to be a former dean of the School of Public and International Affairs being interviewed by the current dean of the school, and the school is in absolutely wonderful hands. So for me, this is just a pleasure to be able to have this conversation. I also have to say to those of you who are from Princeton, of course, this is my hometown now, and I can visualize you in houses around what is still a very small town. But I also want to welcome all of those of you from Charlottesville, which was the town where I grew up, and both towns feature in the book. So this book was invited, and I'm going to explain that. There was a crisis in 2017 at New America, which really turned into a crisis of leadership. And you know, many people have had crises, some worse, probably some not so bad. This really rocked me. And
it ended okay. It was fine. I kept my job, which is the most important thing. But it really triggered a process of reflection, and I started to look back on my time at the State Department, my time as dean, my time at Harvard Law School. I've been in many different jobs, and I started to see patterns. So it wasn't just, okay, here was a crisis, and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and that's that. It really triggered a period of reflection. I think also I was 59 then, I was turning 60 in 2018. That's a moment of reflection just in general. And I wrote an article called When Leadership Means Having to Say You're Sorry, which is the first chapter of the book. And then I talked to a couple of people, and just my own instincts was like, we just got through this crisis. Let's not publish this article and remind everybody. And I wasn't ready, but I kept thinking about it. And at the same time, this idea of renewal, which New America's mission is renewing the promise of America. I've thought a lot about renewal. I gave a speech, a commencement speech at Washington University in St. Louis in 2019, and that was the theme of the speech, was renewal. So then Ruth O'Brien, who runs the Public Square series at Princeton University Press, sends me an email and says, we have this series of shorter books of public affairs, and suddenly it kind of came together. And I wrote back and said, I want to write this book. I want to write this book on renewal. And you actually picked it up in your opening remarks. I had been through a very painful process, and I was still learning and growing. And if you run an organization, and you as a dean of millennials and Gen Z in a time of profound demographic and social and technological change, you're constantly learning, or you're not leading. And so suddenly I thought, maybe there's a way I can use this experience to analogize to a process that I think the country has to go through. I'm not the country, right? and the country holds a multitude of we's, and I talk a lot about that. Nevertheless, this idea that renewal is a process that looks backwards and forwards at the same time, that there's a re and there's a new, not to hang too much on the word, but maybe the facing my past, the looking in the mirror and seeing what other people see rather than what I want to see, that is an analogy for what the country has to do. So I never write a book without a deadline. So the key is you sign a contract and then you have to get it done. But writing this book was a process like none other, because it was weaving together research, but also just things that I had gathered over many years, my personal experience, and then this profound sense that our country is in crisis, and really, how are we going to reach the potential that I see?
Excellent, Amaney. Thank you for that. So let me start about your own positionality as a prominent female leader of the New America Foundation. If you read the book, this is a theme throughout the book, and in conclusion of UC in 2026, a female president.
I do.
You have it all mapped out, which is wonderful. I'm laying the ground for 2030, 2034. So that's fantastic. And I'm just going to read from chapter 1 first. I have different excerpts that I've taken out so that we can sort of discuss together.
Wonderful.
So you say renewal starts with honesty, radical honesty. It was time to let down defenses, to start acknowledging things that I knew to be true and exploring things that might be. This process was partly a version of the therapist's mantra: you have to name it to change it. Yet not everything can be fixed. And then a few pages down, you say this, and this is about your own experiences at this crisis at the New America Foundation. where you were criticized quite harshly. And I don't know the whole story, but it seems that you sustained very harsh criticisms. That's never pleasant. So my sympathies, Anne-Marie. But nevertheless, what you say here is, above all, I kept wondering whether I would have been subject to the same criticisms had I been a man.
Mm.
The double standards for women leaders in every sector are legion. So I want to ask you, as we start thinking about renewal and the call for renewal, would a male leader have written this book? And if not, or if so, what does this mean for the possibility of renewal for the country as a whole?
That's a great question. I think it would be much harder for a man to write this book, although I write about John Gardner, who wrote a book on personal renewal, and very much believed, you had to be learning all the time. He wasn't as vulnerable, but he was also writing in 1963, and no one was that vulnerable. And certainly, if you look at Brene Brown and vulnerability and how to use it, I also think men are beginning to learn at least how to let go of the stereotypical, general on the white horse, CEO who always knows what to do, who's the commanding presence in the room. So I think many men have done that. I agree that I think many men, I've actually tried it out on some, are uncomfortable with this degree of being personal. And I knew that when I wrote it, and I thought, well, not all men will be. I think younger men will have an easier time, and lots of women will understand and resonate. I think also, though, there's a particular role for women in the country right now. And I talk about, the women from the suffragette movement to the Women's Christian Temperance Union to women in the abolitionist movement. And there were many, and it's not just Harriet Beecher Stowe and Harriet Tubman. There are many, many women who played very important roles to right now, where Me Too and Black Lives Matter, both founded by women as moral agents, as people who say that's enough. And frankly, I acknowledge it, women who are relatively affluent, who are at a phase of their lives, you and I are both at what I say phase 3 and call it phase free. We have time, we have energy, we have to take things in hand. And so I also knew that writing this as a woman and knowing that they're double standards, and of course I know they're double standards. And indeed at New America, one of my senior vice presidents, who's a man, said, a lot of the criticism you are getting is deeply sexist, but not using that as an excuse to avoid what I also knew to be true. And the second chapter of the book is called, the first chapter after the introduction is called Run Toward the Criticism. And that comes from David Bradley, who was the editor, the publisher of The Atlantic and still owns Atlantic Media, on my board. And he's a man. And he said, if you're having an argument with your spouse and it's clear to you that you are 98% right, but that maybe your spouse is 2% right, just maybe, you should run toward that 2%. Now, I'm just going to be honest, and my husband, I do not always run toward the 2% when I am having a debate with my husband. I am no saint, but I have really been trying to practice this run toward the criticism. And he was a man that sees it as a sign of strength. So I think there's a way men can take this on board, certainly just as much.
Excellent, Anne-Marie. So in chapter 3, leapfrogging just a bit, because you mentioned chapter 2, and I want to say to the audience, the theme running towards the criticism is this theme that repeats itself throughout every chapter almost. And it's really sort of like a noble kind of acknowledgement, a noble reckoning in terms of like to be a leader and not only to listen, but to embrace those criticisms and critically assess them. And this is, you see this thought process that Amaney is going through in each chapter, and it comes out very nicely. Well done. So, I was like imagining you writing this, Amaney, and kind of like your thought process going into it. It's sort of like well articulated, if you may. When we think about chapter 3, you talk about the need for leaders to take risks, and to be able to forgive themselves. And I'm going to bring it back to gender, and I'm going to bring it back also to another issue that you grapple with throughout the manuscript, both on a personal but professional level, which is how do minorities fit into this paradigm, right? So in terms of risks and risk-taking and forgiveness, at times it sounded like these were personal processes, right? That as individuals, as leaders, we have to learn how to be risk takers and sort of be able to accept those consequences. And if we fail, we need to be able to forgive. But for women, right, and Marie, and you also hint at this, right? For female leaders, where oftentimes female leaders are either given a crisis to fix, or if there is a crisis, they don't emerge from the crisis. There's not room for failure, or there's not room for risk. And perhaps, as you point out yourself, the forgiveness is not the forgiveness capital, right? The forgiveness capital that a woman might receive versus, let's say, a white male, like you point out. We had a president who won the presidency while flaunting very objectionable behavior, right? There was a lot of forgiveness there. So how do you, what, like sitting there in your position, how do you come to terms with these sort of, juxtapositions, but quite honestly, these inequities that structure the lives of female leaders over and over?
Yeah. And indeed, I do grapple with this. So let me start by saying that chapter, talking about risk, starts by talking about the risks that I've taken in my career that I always thought were very risky, and they were, in the sense of, I didn't go to a law firm, I couldn't figure out what I was going to do in several points in my life, including leaving academia to run a nonprofit. I've kind of launched myself into the unknown. And so, as I say, when I give commencement speeches, I talk about taking risks and how important it is. But then in doing research and also just thinking through it, realizing that I could take those risks because I have security, right? I mean, so yes, I graduated from law school and I didn't go to a law firm, and maybe I wouldn't have been able to support myself, but I could have gone home to my parents. I had my parents in a nice house and they would have taken me in. And that similarly, yes, I left academia, but I took over a big organization. I have a husband who, has a secure income. So part of what I'm rethinking is, wait a minute, it's a whole lot easier to take risks when you have a degree of affluence and cushion, which is why, if you actually want many more entrepreneurs, many more innovators, all the things that American politicians and business people talk about, well, then we have to provide much more security. And I've actually seen this as I have worked more with people who come from very different backgrounds than I do, sometimes white from much poorer backgrounds, often African-American or Latinx or other backgrounds of color, where the margin for failure was much, much thinner. And realizing that my advice in those situations, my kind of mentorship, take risk, of course, they're hearing that very differently. And they're thinking, wait a minute, I've got to get this degree. I've got to get a good job. My family's counting on me. I cannot just, sort of follow my passion, all the good things that wealthy people tell their kids to do. So it's sort of a meditation on what it takes for people to take risks. And I do think there for women, it is a double bind, right? Because women actually take risks just as much as men do. And there's very good research on that. But they take different kinds of risks. They take social risks more. And it is definitely true that they will be criticized more often for exactly the same decision that a man would make. So that's the paradox of, in many ways, the whole country faces. Where I come out of it, once I would have said, I want to be as much like a man as I possibly can be. And that's my definition of success, of leadership. Those are my role models. And typically female behavior, I'm leaving that behind. I think about that very differently now. I think gender equality means that the way half of us act, and there is no one way, there are more differences among women than between women and men, but many, many women are going to be more inclined to behave a certain way in a situation, and we should own that. And we should own the way we take risks, and we should call out when there are double standards as much as we can. Now, that is easier for me to say as a relatively powerful person. I get it. But I also think it's time for women to just claim, that part of the world that is ours and design it the way we would have had we run it from the beginning.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for that. So I want to extend this conversation on the theme that you spend a lot of time in the book, always drawing the parallel, kind of juxtaposing your own privileged, if I may, positionality, against what the younger generation and maybe minorities are grappling with as they try to assume power and leadership, and more importantly, what the book is doing. So that you capture that very well, especially when you talk about the intimate relationships you develop with your own staff at the New America Foundation, the mentorship role you played, which was phenomenal. Anne-Marie, but what in the book, there's a prescription, I think, for all organizations and all institutions to start thinking about what it means to sort of incorporate and empower your minority populations. Having said that, so in chapter 4, where it's lead from the center leading from the center and the margins.
Yes.
So I just want to draw my own experiences a little bit. I'm not going to read long excerpts. I told you I would read a long excerpt.
I'd love to hear it.
I'm just going to encapsulate an experience that I had. As a visible woman of color, minority, coming to Princeton, I soon realized when I came to Princeton University as a faculty member, even as assistant professor 18 years ago, I started getting emails from all across the world saying congratulations, you're probably the first visibly Muslim woman to step into the Ivy League as a professor. And so this was a tremendous weight on my shoulders. And I soon began to realize, this of course added to my anxiety and my stress. I was proud, but I soon began to realize that my success, Anne-Marie, was no longer my success alone, and my failure would not be my failure alone. And knowing that I was carrying that weight all the time, I look back and I ask myself, was I able, to take risks that I otherwise would have taken if I didn't feel this tremendous burden that I was carrying? Because, what would it mean if the first visible Muslim in the Ivy Leagues, which I don't even know if this was ever true, by the way, I don't know if it's ever substantiated, but this is what people would say to me, Anne-Marie, right? What would it mean if the first visible Muslim woman in the Ivy Leagues failed?
Yeah.
What would it mean for all these other Muslim women across the globe, first of all? But second of all, you talk about the center, and as you write about the center and needing to reach out to the margins, I kept thinking about, now I'm sort of comfortable at Princeton. I'm the Dean of SPIA. I have 18 years of network capital. I have a prominent one of the world's most prominent institutions backing me up, right? So I'm also in a position of privilege right now, Anne-Marie. But when I was 18 years ago, when I was a first-year assistant professor, I don't know if I had a center.
Mm.
I don't know if I knew what the center looked like. I knew that I was on the margins. And so for all of the minority people reading, you know, women of color, especially right now, reading the book, and they don't have a central or a gravity in the center, but they're always on the margins. And let's just even be, for the sake of conversation, even if they try to enter the center, sometimes they will probably remain on the margins, unless like they're endowed with institutional privilege. Is there room for people to lead from the margins? Or is it that the center is going to have to always go out and capture the margins? And what room is there for people to lead from the margins?
Oh, that's a great question. And I hadn't really thought about it that way, in part because, as I say in the chapter, I've written about leading from the center as in juxtaposition from leading from the top. So I'm assuming my audience is a leader, and I'm juxtaposing hierarchies or ladders with webs. And so I say, look, if you're in a hierarchy, I mean, and of course you and I both are. New America is a hierarchy. SPIA is a hierarchy. You have power over other people. But the traditional way of leading is really, you know, you command and control, or you shape the agenda, or you can sort of work to sort of develop norms. And I've always said, let's flatten that hierarchy. And then it's still power. You mentioned network capital, and that's exactly right. You have all those connections, and the person who leads from the center is the person who's most connected to everybody at that web. But it helps you see then who's at the margin, and the margin is the bottom of the hierarchy. But in many ways, being marginalized is almost worse, right? Because you know that you can sort of see that everybody else is connected to everyone, and you are not. So I was writing for people who have power and saying you really have an obligation to try to flatten your organization. And that could be in a town hall, or maybe not, because often people on the margin they're not going to speak publicly, or certainly not in a big room. So maybe you have an obligation to create smaller settings, but you need to create settings where those power differentials are as small as possible. They're never going to go away, but where you can try to really let people be themselves and feel that they have agency and voice in your organization, even if the next day you have to, reverse back to something that looks more like a hierarchy. What I think, listening to you and thinking about the people who do feel that they're on the margin, and again, as a woman in foreign policy, so you're not just, and it's an interesting question whether you're the first visibly Muslim woman, but you and I both do foreign policy, comparative politics, national security. I was on the margin for a long time, so I know something of it. But I think everybody can think to themselves, I'm on the margin of this circle, but I'm actually at the center of another one. And maybe that is, the people you mentored, your students. And I get what you're saying about the responsibility, because I entered the field at a time when there were not very many women in law teaching, and every woman looks to you, and I can see, that sense that you're carrying all those women's prospects on and reputation on your shoulders. But I think there's a way to think about, okay, here I'm on the margin, and I hope, I'm going to do what I can, but I hope somebody makes room for me. But where am I at the center, and where can I make room for someone else? And if you imagine that sort of radiating outward, the world has many centers, many hubs, many networks. And so there's room for lots of us to make room for those who feel left out.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Really appreciate it. I'm going to ask one question, and I don't know if we should open it up a little bit to the audience to get a little bit of their questions too, and then we'll take it back to the conversation,
Sure.
just in the spirit of involving. But one of the things that you care deeply about, and it comes through mostly from in chapter 6, 7, and 8, like where you start talking about policy. You start talking about, okay, here's like sort of my commitment to this issue. Here's my own personal renewal, my own personal growth, how I am sort of going, my internal sort of like transformation on these issues. But then you say America needs to transform.
It does.
And you talk about the renewal and transformation that has to happen in America. And you talk about the importance of, I mean, in a nutshell, needing to address the growing inequalities in this country. You talk about safety nets, the importance of safety nets, the importance of security nets, and that this needs to be a collective effort. As I was reading, I was sort of thinking, wait, but she's writing in 2021, in 2020, Anne-Marie, we're living in a political climate, right? I'm like, wait, where's going to be the chapter about, like, you know, what we're dealing with in this moment of time in the US, where we're more divided on these issues, where we're more polarized than ever before. I mean, to be fair, you mentioned this, but, you know, getting policy through institutions right now, given where we are in this polarized moment, seems, and I'm not a pessimist, Anne-Marie, but seems a little bit pessimistic. And so I wanted to hear how you were thinking about this. I know you have a lot of hope, and I do too. This is the silver lining in the younger generation to push forward on these issues. But the truth is, the country is divided, Anne-Marie. And if we remain divided, will we ever create an America that can carry everyone?
Yeah, we talk about an America big enough to hold us all. Right. So, yes, I read the news. I'm not blind. I often take refuge in books of all kinds, mysteries, novels, you name it, I escape. But here's the,
and, you know, and I know you're in the heart of this, Anne-Marie. I think part of either it's a self-help mechanism where you've shut it out a little bit. It's in the book, to be fair, but I was expecting like 3 or 4 chapters on it, you know. But
no, but here's my bet.
Yeah,
and it is born of optimism, although, you know, I'm not just saying everything's going to work out, right? The end, I talk about what could be in 2026, the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and the hinge moment where we are moving from a white majority nation to what I call a plurality nation. And I do not talk about majority minority. The whole idea of minorities in American history are people who are discriminated against, right? So the idea that we're all going to be minorities is not reassuring. We are going to be a plurality nation. And it's an extraordinary thing in a democracy to go from a country that has had a clear, overwhelming white majority for most of its history to a country where white Americans, however we define them, and it's a ridiculous set of definitions, will be 49%, but you're going to have many other groups. That moment, that hinge, we may tear ourselves apart. I think it is not out of the question that we could descend into civil war. We had one before, other countries do. This notion that the United States is somehow invulnerable, I think, is being proved wrong. But I also think there's a deeper strand of patriotism. And my bet here is that it is very unusual for somebody who espouses the kind of progressive politics, or left of center anyway, that I do, who also identifies as a patriot. And I quote James Baldwin saying, you know, I love my country so much that I reserve the right to criticize her perpetually. And I'm always saying, you know, my country, right or wrong, when right, to be kept right, when wrong, to be set right. And I think there are a large number of people in this country who, if appealed to with the idea that we really can do this, we're exceptional. Other nations are exceptional too, right? I do not believe that we're sort of, the shining city on the hill. I do think I glory in the diversity of this nation. I love the fact that there you are, who you are in a generation, right? And when I look at the talent and the sort of possibilities of a country that really, it's not going to dismiss race. Race is always is there, and we have to call it out and we have to fight it. But we can be a country that really reflects the world. And in the next 250 years, that's an extraordinary thing. We've got to save the world to begin with. We may not have a planet to have 250 years on, but I'm really trying to do something different. I'm trying to say, of course we're different. There's no such thing as unity and harmony, but we can embrace pluralism. We can agree that different people disagree. We have been like that for most of my lifetime until the last 15 years, and certainly the last 5. And so I'm trying to offer a positive, patriotic vision of where we can go, and welcoming the differences on many policy issues, but saying, let's think big. And on the one hand, let's face our past and let's be unsparing, and particularly for white Americans, there's a lot to face, and it's ugly and it's uncomfortable, and I write about that. But just look at what's on the other side. And so I'm hoping that people want a positive vision and they want to be part of shaping it.
Thank you, Amaney. Before I turn to the questions, I want to push back a little bit on this point, if you don't mind.
Please. It's
So some might say the politics of difference, or the fact that that we're becoming a different America, or a less white America, is the source of the problem. And so while you're sort of hopeful because you sort of have the insight to say this is an America that can come together, others are resistant to that message. Others see this as a threat to American values. Others see this as a threat to American patriotism. And if indeed, and others are winning political gains by mobilizing this mantra, if you may, Anne-Marie. So if we wanted to take a less optimistic, if I may, and I don't want to discourage our readers, but if everybody's saying like we're holding our breaths for 2024 right now. We're holding our breaths in terms of what might come around the corner, because we're a fractured society and difference is not our strength. It's probably a liability today. How would you respond to that? How would you respond to our children who are worried about that?
Well, I would start by saying, yes, I think unquestionably this degree of demographic change is at the root of much of our politics. Not all, but an awful lot of it. This sense that the country I know is disappearing is very frightening. And it's true in Europe too. And in Europe, you often hear, of course, in France, it's about food, right? So in France, you hear people saying, good French housewives, saying, well, these people who live in the same apartment building, their food doesn't smell right. They're cooking North African food instead of great French food, even though North African food has its own cuisine. But and Britain, of course, if you look at Brexit, a lot of it was about, Eastern Europeans taking English jobs, but a lot of it, particularly toward the vote, was Syrians are going to overrun us. So I am not, and I grew up in the American South, I'm not naive about, white people all saying, oh, great. I think a lot of people are scared, but I am making a bet that in the end, the Americanness and the sense that this is integral to who we are. And we were always a country of difference, but it was originally religious. If you looked at the early states, right, you had Puritans in Massachusetts, you had a Jewish community in Rhode Island, and also Congregationalists. You had Catholics in Maryland, and Quakers in Pennsylvania, and Anglicans in Virginia. And those differences were really big. In fact, all those folks had fled, persecution generally in many of those states. So and then we of course went from upper class white Anglo-Saxons to lots of different Europeans who seemed very different to the folks who started. So I think this is at the root of a lot of this, but I want to say to people, look, we first have to face it, and just calling everybody racist or not anti-racist is not enough. That's not going to get us there. A lot of us have a lot of work to do, but also there has to be this vision. That's why I call it renewal. There has to be this sense that we together, as uncomfortable as it might be, but we can hold a vision of America that holds us together. And again, it's not harmony, it's not unity. I think there's a lot of really nasty stuff ahead. And as I said, it may fail, but this is what I can offer. And it is a combination I don't think we see very much of, because love of country and this kind of politics sit uneasily together. Although interestingly, I think many communities of color who have been relatively recent immigrants respond, because they did come to this country, and we don't have the kind of social mobility we used to, but we still are often better than lots of other places.
Thank you for that, Anne-Marie. And, I think the point about thinking about, not the country we live in now, but the country we want to be part of,
Exactly.
and our role in building that country, right? So I often say to students and to people who will talk about or lament about, racism or Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, that these, in essence, are not part of being American. I mean, these type of these xenophobic extensions, if you may, in and of themselves, are anti-American and
right.
un-American. So I really appreciate your point on that. There is a question in the chat that I think is only fair, and I want to apologize to the audience if I sort of felt I was having this conversation about the crisis in Anne-Marie's life. Actually, if you read the book, there's more than one crisis. Sorry, Anne-Marie. But this is the one in 2017 that set things in motion at the New America Foundation. So yep. the audience would like to hear a little bit more about this crisis, Anne-Marie. We only get like a couple of sentences, but you might want to say a little bit more about that.
Yes, I mean, so, the point of this book is not to relive a particular crisis. So I will say it was a situation in which we were accused of, we as an organization, the leadership of the organization, of firing someone because of pressure from Google. And it blew up. It was right at the beginning of the tech clash. It blew up very quickly because it was big bad Google, imposing pressure on a think tank that was supposed to be independent, who caved. And of course, I'm the leader of that think tank, and there are articles on the front page of the New York Times. I did not do that. Some people will never believe that I did not do that, but I am quite confident that I did not do that. But I made a number of really serious mistakes as a leader in terms of how I handled it, both before the crisis and definitely after it. And I write in the book, I'm a leader who also sits on many boards, and many of us are. And so, if you're on a board, you might like a leader, you might just think he or she is wonderful, but you can also say, I have a fiduciary duty to this organization, and this person is either is so damaged they can't lead, or is so culpable they can't lead. And so, it would have been, it certainly was possible that I would have lost my job. My board believed me, but again, that's not necessarily the criteria. So that was the crisis. It's well past. What I say is the actual specifics are not important. What was important was that it was big enough to be on the front page the paper of record. And a lot of people, and probably to this day, if you Google me or whatever, you will see this thing, and it really, it's not like I hadn't faced adversity before. I certainly had. I was dean of SPIA, Amaney, so I certainly faced controversy and bad publicity and that, but nothing like this. Although I'd worked for Hillary Clinton and worked for a lot of people who have much worse publicity, but it shook me. And it almost upended my life. And what I say in the book is, all of us have had crises. Some of them are much worse. And now when I see my friends going through, real trouble, and I also know that what papers write, is not always the full truth. I believe in truth. This is not fake news, but there are deeper stories.
So Amaney, thanks for that. So in the book, you say this over and over, and you said it again this evening, which is that I made a lot of mistakes. And you say and you even go back and say, you talk about the mistakes that looking back as dean of SPIA, you would have done maybe a few things differently. And through, and again, this is like true leadership at its best. So for you to go through these incidents, I was taking notes. Amaney, don't do that. Amaney, don't follow Anne-Marie on this. So thank you so much for the guide there, Anne-Marie. But in this moment where there's basically a scandal on your hands, right?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand what you did. This is for me, because I tried to go back and say, well, what did she do that was so wrong? Everybody was telling you handled it wrong, but you have a scandal on your hands. You're accused of basically, violating fiduciary law.
Right.
You could lose your job, but you're saying, oh, I handled it wrong. And I didn't understand why you thought you handled it wrong. Like,
just because it blew up into a much bigger thing than it had to. And
how
also
could you have prevented that?
Oh, many ways. I mean, that's what leaders do. If you make a decision and it's going to have repercussions, you have a strategy, you're there, you consult. A lot of what I recognized was I simply didn't consult enough, which I also said was true when I was dean. Consulting takes time, right? And as a leader, I've always got, all of us have too much on our plates, and I am terminally overcommitted, but here was a situation where, as a leader, I can look at it now, and again, I sit on many boards, and I'm still leading, but I really needed to appreciate the worst case scenario. Look, we've just been through the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where nobody seems to have said, what is the worst case? What if? So I never asked, what if there's a terrible article on the front page of the New York Times? What are we going to do? I owed it to my organization to ask that question and have an answer. Who knows what would have happened, but I would, as a leader, I really should have consulted more to begin with. There probably were other outcomes that would have accomplished what I needed to accomplish, but maybe better. I'll never know, but I certainly knew when I look back that that I had, and again, my reputation is important, but being a leader, as you just said, you're leading for others, but I have this duty to my organization, and to the, all those folks who depend on our reputation and our grant money and all of that.
No, I appreciate that, Anne-Marie. So one of our anonymous attendees has a question for you. And basically, Anne-Marie, you speak so much about reading. And actually in this book, Anne-Marie basically is reading poetry, she's reading theory, she's reading Odyssey. This is like a tour de force in terms of getting your literary overview 101. So please pick up the book. But the anonymous attendee asked, I'm wondering what are some authors and books you also recommend? I don't know if it's on this topic or maybe your favorites, but you get the favorites in the book.
I was going to say, yes. If you, in a way, I'm always reading 3 or 4 books at a time. I always have some some sort of classic, some nonfiction, some serious fiction, and some just escapism.
Yeah, right.
And it just
You need
depends.
it.
Right, exactly. It depends on how the day's been as to what I turn to at the end of the night. So there's a lot. I say by Renewal, there are many, many books that I've read, and one of the things that I really have been doing in terms of trying to open my mind and to understand other races, other cultures. It does take work. One of my president, who's African American and Filipinos, when he was interviewing for a job at New America, he said one of the things that he does in diversity, equity, and inclusion work is to say, think about the 10 people in your life who are most important to you outside your family, the people you would call if something happened. For most of us, that group of 10 is going to be whatever race or ethnicity we are. And certainly that was true of me until a couple of years ago. And so, but one of the things you can do, you can't always change who your friends are, although you can work at it, but you can read. And the wealth of novels, of fiction. I mean, obviously, Indian American literature is its own genre. And in recent years, African American novelists, who are just spectacular. I mean, not just Toni Morrison, although Toni Morrison's amazing, but you can literally travel the cultures of the country just through reading, particularly fiction. And I've done a lot of that. And honestly, Amazon's quite helpful, or wherever you buy your books. In Labyrinth, you'll go and you'll see, if you liked this book, then there are other books that are there. I still believe in browsing the old-fashioned way.
That's awesome. Ruth Miller has joined us, and she says, what can you say to a pessimist about the divisions in the country that prevent beneficial policies from becoming reality? We sort of touched on this, but maybe hit the policy dimension a little more, Anne-Marie.
Hi, Ruth. Ruth and I worked together intensively for the 75th anniversary of SPIA, which was in 2005, and really was great fun. We went all around the country and even around the world.
Wow.
So here's what I would say. I have a very specific answer here, which is the United States must change our political system, right? There's nothing in the Constitution about being a two-party system. And indeed, the framers, who were supposed to be practical men, actually believed that there would be no parties, which is kind of rich because, Federalist number 10 is all about factions. And they must have believed in their design of the government so profoundly that they thought factions and factionalism would be countered and there wouldn't be parties. But they're very quickly, given the way we apportion votes, we fell into a two-party system where the party that gets the majority of the votes, even if it does not get a majority of votes, and we know that because all our recent presidents have been elected without 51% of the vote as a whole, wins. And you might want a third party, but if you vote for that third party, you're handing the election to the party you don't want. There is nothing that requires that. And America is quite capable of dramatic changes in our political system. Until the beginning of the 20th century, first place, women didn't vote. And of course, before 1965, African Americans didn't vote, weren't even allowed to legally, and didn't for a very long time. But we also changed the way we elect senators. We used to elect senators by the legislature of every state, and now it's direct election. So we need to adopt a version of ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting, effectively voting for the some final number of candidates, can be 4 or 5, who are simply the best candidates. And the candidate who wins must get a majority. And there are many different systems to do that. Maine has adopted this system. Alaska has adopted this system. It's on the ballot in many other states. Many cities, New York adopted it last year. We are going to be a plurality nation, and we have to have an electoral system that allows us to express ourselves better than are you a Democrat or are you a Republican, when actually Lee Drutman, my colleague, just published this in the New York Times. There are 6 parties out there, at least, right, where you have different views. So that I do think we have to do, or we're not going to be able to express who we are as a plurality nation, and we can do it.
Excellent. Okay. Yes. So Anne-Marie Ruth has given you an optimistic message and a direct sort of policy goal right there. So we always like policy goals. From Carolyn Purnell, are you considering running for office, Anne-Marie? Will you spearhead this like electoral reform effort, if you may?
So in the book, I say that I have been asked after public events whether I would run for office, and I've always said if I lived in Great Britain, where there's public financing of elections and it's a 6-week campaign, I think I would have. And honestly, if I were in my 30s today and married to somebody else, I might think about it. My husband is not going to be a political spouse. And as much as I do, I plan to devote the next 5 years or more to building up to 2026 and doing everything I can to bring about this kind of change. I think I can do it better as a writer, as the head of a think tank that is devoted to big ideas, as an emerita professor who can still partner with a great university. I've thought about this a great deal. And in the end, in part because of how complicated our political system is, I think I'm better off arguing for big change than I am actually trying to work within this system.
And I believe chapter 8 in the book is entitled Big Change to
Yes.
Big Ideas, Big Change, Big Ideas that lead to big change. So again, another reason why you should pick up the book. I have 2 more questions from the audience, Stacy Wolf and Nadia Christen. Let me take Stacy's first because she wrote in first. What's the role of culture and representation in creating political change? And how can the insistence on alternate realities and truths, fake news, anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, I added that, by the way, Stacey, be challenged by positive visions?
Yeah. Well, so again, there is a lot of policy work we need to do here. I mean, it really is. A lot of the algorithms and the business models that allow for the kind of targeting and the dissemination of not just fake news, insanity. I mean, some of this stuff is just crazy. But we actually know that, sort of surfing YouTube can be an addiction. I had 2 teenage boys. It is designed, if you look at the social network, it is designed to sort of send you into an ever more extreme rabbit hole. Right. We're not going to suppress speech, but there is a lot that you can do to have stuff come up on your screen to be ever more extreme. There's a lot that you can do to change the business model and the incentives to design technology not to drive us further apart. I'm not saying it's going to all make us, hold hands, but there are many of the pathologies that we have right now are pathologies of technology that policy can help to fix, and so too can different kinds of competition. I do also think that, and it's sort of, it's everybody says it's the cop out, but we do need digital literacy, right? I find even my own sons, very well educated, grew up obviously in a critical house, a house where we were always challenging things. Look at videos and say, Joe Biden actually did this. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You have to know that that's a fake. So one of my friends says that actually in 3rd and 4th grade, we need to teach kids how to make fake videos, that they, once they understand what you can do, they will be much more skeptical. Just as, honestly, many of us had to grow up sort of learning what was good television and what was bad television. I mean, there's a lot of education that goes there. So I do, it's horrifying to me that we are in this age where the very, question of is there a pandemic and does a vaccine work seems insane. But I think a lot of education will help. The other thing I would say is read another book, Adam Grant's book, Think Again. He's an organizational psychologist at the Wharton School. And it's a wonderful account of how, even when you have very different realities, you can actually reach others.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amaney, for that. Nadia's question, speaking of anniversaries, how do you think Princeton should prepare for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, given the renewal message of your great book?
Well, Amaney will
I'll
be
take
part
notes.
of it.
I'll take notes.
I mean, I actually think Princeton has a huge potential role to play, because whether it will embrace it or not, I don't know. But Princeton has been always the Southern Ivy League, right? And I met all the Ivy. We know Brown was founded by slave traders. I mean, this is not only a Southern issue, but it is also true that my father, who was class of 53, describes walking the campus, and at night you look in the dorm rooms and seeing plenty of Confederate flags. And indeed, in 1980 or 1979, I was a resident advisor. I was a senior. I was a resident advisor, and I was in 1901. And this kid from South Carolina shows up and puts up a Confederate flag, and one of his roommates, because he's from South Carolina, one of his roommates is an African-American boy from Richmond, Virginia. And there, I'm dealing with it. I convinced him to take it down. But Princeton has a lot of facing to do. And Princeton has done a lot of great things. I love walking around the campus now and seeing they've put up plaques in so many places. Some very sobering, and you think about, enslaved people who were there, were never acknowledged who they were. Some also just celebrating people who were marginalized, who were more than marginalized, who were invisible for so long. That's great. I think there's also what is it that Princeton really has to face? Obviously, changing the name of SPIA was a big one. And a recognition that, as somebody put to me, white people can't just always add something on. Sometimes they have to give something up that matters to them. And for a lot of people, that was giving up a name, a history, somebody they venerated. But I would start with the radical honesty piece. And then I really would think about, what does Princeton look like as an American university, a great American university, and I hope a more global university, if in fact, its students are those Americans who reflect the world? And then how can Princeton help connect the world? That's probably where I'd start.
Wonderful. So Amaney, I have another question for you. We don't have any more questions in the chat, but before I've been dominating all the questions. I want to make sure I ask you this question for you to reflect on. With any book, there are, for the author, there are the parts that you write, which are basically your favorite parts. You wake up in the morning and you're actually really eager to go to the computer to write. And there are other parts of the book where you're struggling and you're looking for excuses not to write. Can you tell me, what were your favorite parts of writing this book and why? And what were the parts you struggled with the most and why?
Spoken like an author to an author. Oof. So the first thing I have to say, this is the hardest book I've ever written, and it got revised substantially twice. And then one good, not the whole thing, but a good set of revisions as late as January with Princeton University Press. It was pretty late by then. So there was a lot of rewriting in this book. the parts that I loved writing are the stories. I'll just give some examples where I talk about giving and receiving grace, and I write about receiving grace, and a quote from A River Ran Through It by Norman Maclean, that Vincent Stanley, who's the chief philosopher at Patagonia, and how he talked about grace. And the book is written without subheads, right? So it's just these sort of like bars connecting these different segments. And these segments that were self-contained like that, sort of a vignette that made a point. Yeah. The other one that I love is, as I think people know, I've become a passionate birder. And I have a section on what it is to be a birder and how waking up to birds it was an analogy for me to waking up to discrimination. Obviously I've always paid attention to the women in the room, but I haven't always paid attention to the people of color in the room. I see the world more brightly, more vividly, more sharply. So those are the parts I loved writing. The harder parts, the policy parts, are always hard because it's hard to make them interesting. Like you and I have been deans of a public policy school. We are not representative of the larger reading public. So trying to find ways to write about really big ideas in the chapter Bill Big, it was hard, and definitely trying to. This is the thing. It is a vulnerable book. I wouldn't have written it if I didn't feel like I've come out stronger and more confident on the other side. So I didn't want to write it to say, I fell apart, look at all the really terrible things in my life. I wanted to write it in a way that said, yeah, I really had to face some tough stuff. But you know what? In doing it, I'm actually not somebody you should take pity on. I hope this is a process you'll be encouraged to undertake yourself. And that was a very, very hard balance to strike.
Yeah, and I love Anne-Marie on that point, how you can, the analogy was that America, if it can undergo this process, will come out stronger and more confident and more solid and more integrated as well. So that's like that duality that was often in the parallelism, if you may.
Exactly.
Was really well done. I'm going to ask another question on like this topic, and you don't have to answer it, Anne-Marie. You can say pass. What would you say? What did the reviewers like most about the book, and what did they challenge you on? And what, as authors, we want to get our work published, so we're willing to sort of entertain reviewer comments. But at some point, we say no, we're going to push back. So can you reflect on that at all?
Sure. Well, and I say actually in the acknowledgments that one of my closest friends in the world, my oldest friend, read it, and she and her husband sort of said, this is incoherent, because the first, again, weaving it through, it's really like braiding a ribbon or something where you have to get the balance right. So I think there was definitely, the first round of comments were, look, there's not enough of a narrative frame. I had told my story and then I'd gone on to tell other stories. So I had to weave my own story as the kind of backbone of the book, or the thread that ties all those chapters together. And that was common. I also, and I'll reflect on this, my first draft was way too white. And one of my assistants, who, she's an assistant and a colleague, she's the project manager, read it and just said, take a look at your footnotes. You're writing about a plurality nation and you are mostly citing white people. Wow. And that was obviously very powerful to me, and started a whole nother round of reading and going back to books I'd read. Obviously I couldn't, but I'd read many, but again, I always notice whether women are cited. I always notice. I read the New York Times op-ed page and I'm looking to see, and if a columnist as usual cites only men, I notice it, but I hadn't noticed. And so, in the writing of this, I'm basically having to live what I'm writing about. And that was a very, very important set of comments.
Wonderful.
And she was
Wonderful.
willing to be honest. That's the other thing I'm calling for, right? We have got to be more
Radical
honest.
honesty.
Radical honesty. We're very uncomfortable. No, many white people I know are very uncomfortable talking about race.
Awesome. Awesome. I want to see if our audience has any additional questions. So Anne-Marie, in the spirit of, do you have questions for me about your book?
No, I love the way you introduced it. I guess I would say I really hope I hope it is a book that you can read. You can read it all at once, but you can dip into it. You can keep it and use and turn to it. I loved the fact that you said to me, on dark days, I will turn to it.
It will be the go-to resource on my bookshelf, Anne-Marie, because it's as you said, you could read this like in like a solid afternoon, right?
Yeah, it's short.
Kind of cuddle up with your blanket and read it. But I also know where the each chapter also it captures a different sort of dimension that's very important for leadership, but self-reflection and growth, if I may, a renewal. And that's also very important. And I'll be honest with you, Anne-Marie, throughout my reading of the book, I would just pause and say, you know what, I've always admired her, but now I admire her more for saying this, or for acknowledging this, or stepping up to the plate and accepting responsibility, because let's just be honest about it, Anne-Marie, not many people do that. And sometimes it's easier to stay in your stubborn, inaccurate, wrong way than to accept blame and responsibility. And that's why my first question was, well, would a man do this? So, yeah. But I come out of this experience, if I may. First of all, again, this has been I've done a lot lately. I've really enjoyed doing this. I'm honored to be here this evening with Princeton University Press and Princeton Public Library, huge fans. And to have you as our former dean, again, Anne-Marie, you sort of laid the path for many of us following in your footsteps. And I'm going to take your advice to heart. So it will be my go-to resource. And if any woman out there who's dealing with any organization or leadership capacity, and you say this yourself, Anne-Marie, even with your kids or your families, there's a lot of insight and self-reflection in this book. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It was a great conversation, and thank you to the library and to Labyrinth and to the press.
Okay, and I want to just thank everybody who's logged on here tonight. It was great questions. Again, the library is just so thrilled, along with Labyrinth, for this series, that this is the first of our events for the season. We love working with the Princeton University Press. We have a lot of other events coming up with the University Press. And I did put in the chat, including one that we're able to do in person, because it's going to be outside in the woods for the launch of Treepedia. And Joan Malouf is here from the UK. And so we teamed up with the Friends of Herringtown Woods. So this Friday at 6 p.m., come to the woods where we can be outside safely and celebrate a book. So I put the information on the chat. This was a wonderful conversation, and I can't wait to get my hands on the book myself and give it a good read through. And as I said, Labyrinth has your signed copies in stock. So for those of us who live in Princeton, go by the store. It gets released tomorrow. The signed copies are there. Mention this event and get your 10% discount. So thank you, Labyrinth. Thank you, School of Public and International Affairs, and everybody else. It's been a great night. And thank you for allowing us to go a little bit over time to get in all those great questions. This was wonderful. So thank you so much. Thank you. And we're going to say goodnight now.
Congratulations, Anne-Marie.
Thank
yes,
you.
Congratulations.
Thanks, Annie. I can't wait. We got lots of business to do together.
Yes, great.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.